Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of our podcast, Career Diaries by Elemed, the podcast dedicated to talking about exceptional careers in the MedTech industry. And today, I'm really happy to have with me David Fischel, CEO of Stereotaxis. Hello, David.
Hi, good morning.
How are you doing?
Okay, thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's super exciting to speak to a CEO and especially one with such a versatile background, and I'm really excited to kind of jump in. Are you able to maybe give us a brief intro as to who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm the CEO of Stereotaxis. We're a robotic medical device company that has developed and commercialized robotic systems to do endovascular surgical procedures. And specifically to do a type of procedure used to treat heart arrhythmias. We're based in St. Louis, the United States. I'm originally from Los Angeles and come to the medical device world actually through the finance side, having invested in medical device companies for many, many years.
That's super interesting because reading through your profile as well, I had the chance to see that you did come in through the finance side and you came in obviously from having worked with various different startups earlier on in your career, but more looking at it from the perspective of a VC. But we will get there. But I'm really interested to know right from the beginning, kind of like, where did it all start? What was it about the medical device industry that caught your interest?
The beauty of working in medicine is that, and medical devices specifically, is that you combine multiple kind of challenges and kind of and specialties all in one. So on the one hand, you have human biology and medicine, which is intrinsically fascinating, and trying to work to improve that is intrinsically motivating. You have on top of that technology, and when you look at something like robotics, but across medical devices, you have a mix of mechanical engineering and electrical engineering and software, and the combination of all of those together is fun and it's exciting and it's challenging. And then you have the whole business dynamic, and like in any business, there's challenges, and you have to think about psychology, and you have to think about marketing, and you have to think about strategy and finance and IT and kind of many other things. And so kind of working in the business of medical devices by combining human biology, medicine, with technology, with the challenge of running a business is a beautiful combination.
So if we rewind all the way back, so what you said that you came up, through finance. When did you first get exposure to the medical device industry?
So my parents are actually physician scientists, both of them. My father's a pediatric hematologist oncologist, and my mother was a research scientist. She did her PhD in artificial pancreas. And in the 90s, both of them gradually transitioned to learning that there was this world where medicine and finance interacted. And in 1999, they founded a hedge fund based in Los Angeles called Daphne Capital Management, focused really on the life sciences, earlier stage, publicly traded biotechnology, and then also medical device companies. I worked with them kind of all throughout my schooling. I would work on the side with them. And in university, I studied math and I studied finance. And after graduating, I went to Israel to work in an Israeli medical device venture capital firm called SAP Vitalife. And Israel is particularly good at medical devices. The ecosystem there is very robust. It's a very exciting ecosystem. And so I started to focus on medical devices with the view that both that would be a good thing to do given that I was in Israel, and that it would complement my parents' focus, which was on primarily on biotechnology companies. And so I started that immediately after university, and then I came back to Los Angeles. I joined our firm with medical devices being my primary focus, and I was a portfolio manager of those investments. And medical device companies are a little bit different than biotechnology companies, because if you look at most publicly traded biotechnology companies, they're still pre-commercial. So you have a drug that's in the clinic, and the real analysis in question is what's the likelihood of that drug coming to having successful clinical trials, receiving regulatory approvals, and coming to market. The inverse is true on the medical device side, where the vast majority, probably 80% of publicly traded medical device companies, are actually in the earlier stages of commercialization. So you have a device, you've brought it to market, and now the question is how that device will be adopted. And the dynamics of adoption are very complicated because, unlike maybe a consumer good in the medical device field, you have a complicated adoption ecosystem. You have multiple parties who have a say in the adoption of a device. You have the patient, you have the physician, you have the providers, the hospitals, you have the payers, the insurance or the governments. And so that the incentives and disincentives of each of one of those parties makes adoption complicated in medical devices. And I really was focused on understanding both the clinical utility of an individual technology for an individual unmet medical need and the adoption dynamics.
So that's really interesting, especially because right now there's quite a hot topic, with the new medical device regulation. I know that you're in the US, but is that something that you're following in terms of something that's coming out in Europe right now?
Yeah,
you're familiar.
We've been following that.
So I've been to kind of quite a few conferences, and I lead the MDR discussion forum on LinkedIn, and something, and I'm interested to get your perspective on this. So something that people do talk about is how the MDR might potentially change the landscape of the startup world in the medical device industry, particularly in Europe, because due to the requirements that will now be imposed because of the new regulation with things like clinical data, it potentially could be argued that startups might find it more difficult to actually get their products to the market. So does that change the landscape? And does that mean that, events need to happen sooner in terms of potential acquisitions, for example, or, basically, being
Sure.
bought by bigger companies? What's your thought on that as somebody who's seen it from the finance side?
So I think everything is incremental. I don't think that kind of MDR versus MDD is a complete phase change. I think what you have is that regulators globally, whether you look at the FDA or you look at the notified bodies in Europe, they're caught between actually a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they have a mandate to protect the public from medicines that could cause harm or that aren't proven, and on the other hand, they have a mandate to bring to market therapies that could provide a benefit. And obviously, the amount of evidence that you want to have prior to allowing a therapy to come to market kind of puts you those two goals are in some ways countering each other, are opposite each other, and regulators have to balance that those two conflicting goals. What you've seen in the medical device field is generally Europe being more accommodating to devices. So it allowed more therapies to come to market more quickly. That's positive in that it gives patients and physicians more choices. It's negative in that you can have therapies that aren't as well proven, causing harm until that harm is noticed. And the FDA has been a little bit more stringent. Now, even those are broad generalizations because different divisions within the FDA and different types of devices are regulated differently. And so there isn't, again, these are kind of broad generalizations. MDR, which has actually been now delayed for a year to 2021 because of COVID, is generally shifting the European geography closer towards the US geography. And yeah, every time you increase the level of regulation and you increase that burden, it makes it more difficult for smaller companies. There's a societal cost to making it more difficult for smaller companies to operate, increasing kind of the threshold by which you need to operate in order to just be financially solvent. So there's clearly a downside to something like MDR. I guess kind of as a society, we have to always tell ourselves what balance do we want in terms of allowing there to be risks of unknown risks to different therapies that are on the market versus making it easier for innovation to come to market.
So do you think that it will be more difficult then for startups to survive in the future?
Definitely. It makes it harder and it makes it more costly. Now, again, there's a benefit to it, and I guess that the European regulators probably were looking at the benefit in terms of reducing risk to patients that an unproven device comes to market. But the cost is that innovation will suffer.
So obviously, you said as well when you were kind of working as a VC, also in Israel, it has such a dynamic startup landscape. And knowing that some of our listeners might be startup CEOs out there, I'd love to get just some tips and hints on what mistakes maybe that you've seen founders make and what they need to be doing in order to be building a successful MedTech startup. I know it's a massive topic, but maybe like your top 3 tips on that would be great.
Oh gosh, that's a tough question. I mean, there's the beauty of being an investor is that you're forced to look at hundreds and hundreds of case studies. Right, as you analyze each individual company, as you're forced to make a decision of what you think the likelihood of them being successful is, and then as you follow their progress over time, whether you've invested in them or not, you actually get the benefit of reviewing hundreds and hundreds of case studies. And what you see over time is the multitude of reasons why technologies or businesses fail. And some are completely outside anyone's control because human biology is still, as much as we better understand it and better define it, there's still so many unknowns and so many aspects of biology that are just, you start a trial, and that's why we have clinical trials, because as good as the mechanistic rationale is, and as good as some of the preclinical data could be, sometimes when you do something in the human body, things don't play out as you would expect, and so those are the things that you can't really de-risk perhaps up front. You can get an assessment for how de-risked a certain approach is prior to doing it, but there is that kind of uncertainty that just exists. Because human biology is still kind of only partially understood. Beyond that, there are many different reasons why companies fail, and it spans kind of a broad spectrum. So it's useless almost listing it out because really kind of there's every company can fail in its own issue, whether it's because you develop a product that really doesn't have a market need, or the market need is not substantial enough, or you don't think about the details of the product in terms of how the users will use it. You don't think about all of the potential stakeholders in the adoption of the product, right? Like the patient, the physician, the provider, and the payer. You don't design it at a cost that would be feasible for the market to bear and for you to have an economic return. You have manufacturing issues, you have IP issues, you have regulatory issues. You don't deal with human resources in an appropriate way, and you have issues that bog the company down there. There's a multitude of reasons why companies fail, and what you see kind of oftentimes on why companies are successful, we often think that it's one brilliant idea and that's what leads to a company's success. What you oftentimes see is that companies are built the same way that careers and the same way that individuals are built. Yes, sometimes you have someone who just wins the lottery on one day and their entire life is different going forward. But for the vast majority of us, and I think it's the same thing also for companies, it's built off of making hundreds and thousands of micro decisions every day that are good decisions and incrementally are smart and incrementally moving in the right way forward. And when you are persistent and you continuously make kind of the right micro decisions on a regular basis, and you're directionally, in terms of the big decisions, directionally you're moving in the right general direction, then I think you have kind of a successful company. And I think that's when you look at most companies, they're not built overnight, they're built over years, and it's a multitude of these right little decisions all coming together. And the same reason why companies sometimes fail it can be driven by a multitude of kind of smaller issues that over time exacerbate a situation.
Yeah, I think that's so important and so interesting, seeing it from the perspective of actually success is essentially built out of minor positive, moves in the right direction, rather than one major, event that's going to completely change your life. It's more about laying the foundation step by step and ensuring, that basically what you're doing, from the beginning is layering it up, rather than just waiting for that big moment and thinking about things in terms of like really big decisions. I think that's so important. So the other thing that, I wanted to come back to then, so if we talk about technology right now, because also I'm really interested to get your perspective on the future of what the MedTech space is going to look like. We're seeing more and more true, let's say, technology companies coming into this space. What do you think are going to be like some of the game-changing things coming out over the next few years?
And medicine is very, very broad. So maybe I can talk a little bit about kind of Stereotaxis and what excited me about Stereotaxis, because I think there's two big secular trends that kind of were converging that interested me in Stereotaxis. Again, there's many trends out there in medicine. Fortunately, there's thousands and thousands of creative, innovative people that are all pushing the boundaries forward, and that's good for all of us, because unfortunately there is still a lot of unmet medical need in the world. It still is. If you have, God forbid, a disease, it's miserable being a patient, and so there's a lot of work for us as a society to do to address that. When I think about kind of the two big secular trends that kind of I think Stereotaxis is very much in the center of, the first is this trend towards reduced invasiveness of procedures, which is beneficial both in that it reduces the risk of a procedure and kind of in that sense improves outcomes, and secondly is beneficial in that it improves access to therapy. And so if you look at generally surgical procedures, you can categorize them in three big buckets: open surgeries, laparoscopic surgeries, and endovascular surgeries. And what you've seen over the last few decades is this trend from open to laparoscopic to endovascular surgery. When you look at, let's say, coronary bypass surgery as an example, you had hundreds of thousands of those procedures being done. And when stents started to emerge, coronary stents, you suddenly had a transition where the number of CABG procedures was reduced almost in half, but the number of stent procedures suddenly went into the millions. And so both you had a kind of a transition of some of the CABG surgeries, open chest, sternotomies, and very invasive surgeries. You had some of that transition to very minimally invasive catheter-based endovascular stent procedures. But what you also had was you had millions of patients who otherwise were not receiving any therapy because the risk of an open surgery was just too high to bear. So you would just live with the disease and probably die early because of it. You suddenly had them being treated with minimally invasive surgery. And so that's kind of one big secular trend. And then the other big secular trend is this transition to a more digital, connected, robotic environment. And when you look at kind of most interventional procedures, still surgeons learn and decisions are made largely based off of heuristics. You try a device a few times, you like it or you don't like it. Your small experience with a few patients kind of drives your decision making on whether to continue using it or not. And that's obviously in a world where we can digitize much more information and we can try to glean insights from that digitization. That's somewhat of an archaic approach. And so when I look at kind of what Stereotaxis was doing, and that's what really attracted me to join the company, because while I've invested in hundreds of medical device companies, those were always passive, fundamental investments. This was really kind of our first time becoming actively involved in building and managing a company. And what attracted me was that the impact of robotics in laparoscopic surgery with Intuitive Surgical's Da Vinci system, and in open surgeries, hip, knee arthroplasty, spine surgery, are obviously well documented, and those fields are being really revolutionized by robotics. When you look at interventional medicine, there's really very, very little robotics being leveraged at all. And when I looked at Stereotaxis, there was a very elegant approach by using actually kind of externally applied magnetic fields interacting with interventional devices that have tiny magnets at their tips, where you could completely reimagine the mechanistic limitations of traditional endovascular catheters and guide wires and other interventional devices, and you could allow them to overcome what were otherwise inherent limitations like precision or stability or reach or kind of safety. And so kind of that's one. I think that the more that we can enable endovascular surgery to be better and to overcome its inherent limitations, the more that you're going to see that continued drive towards less and less invasive surgery. And then the second is, as you take something that is held by the human hand and is manipulated kind of by the hand, and you suddenly allow it to be controlled with a robot, yes, you get the mechanistic benefits of precision or stability, but more than that is you get a digitization of the procedure and all of the benefits in terms of connectivity, in terms of learning from insights from an accumulated data set, providing more insights to the physician intraoperatively based on the patient-specific data, providing more insights based on the accumulated data over thousands of procedures, and kind of you shift towards this world of digital surgery.
It's a fascinating space, the robotics piece, and we've been doing more and more recruitment for medical robotics companies. You know that it's a niche area, but it's growing super fast. And it's one that I find absolutely fascinating, which is why I wanted to speak with you today. And that was why I was also so excited to have you on. You spoke about moving from being kind of a passive investor to taking more of an active role. And now obviously you're CEO of Stereotaxis. I'm super interested to know what's the backstory to that. So how did it even come about?
So when you're an investor, you're looking for situations where the current reality of a company does not reflect its potential, and you think that gap can be bridged. And usually, as a passive investor, you want that gap to be bridged through actions not on your own. So it's you foresee that things in the environment or moves that the company are going to make are going to bridge that gap. When I came across Stereotaxis, I was kind of intrigued by this this setup that was kind of the biggest gap and the biggest discrepancy that I had seen so far. Where on the one hand, there was a company that was kind of largely failing. You had kind of many years of revenue decline. You had a company that had almost 20 million debt, almost no cash, and was burning a significant amount of money every year, and was really kind of on the edge of going out of business. And so that's kind of obviously a scary, terrible setup, and doesn't really, that tells you want to stay away. In reality, you're crazy to be looking at it any further. On the counter side, though, you had a company that had a very elegant, differentiated approach to endovascular surgery, and kind of really was by far the global leader in terms of installed base, in terms of procedures, in terms of revenue in robotics and endovascular surgery. Not only was it a very differentiated, elegant approach, but it was actually well validated in the real world. So we have 100 hospitals that are have treated over 100,000 patients to date. So you have kind of real world validation that the system is robust. It's not working at just one or two or three, key opinion leader sites that are kind of very much aligned with the company. It's being used broadly in the community. And the clinical data then was as good as it comes. Where when you look at the clinical literature, every study, which is a head-to-head study looking at Stereotaxis' robotic cardiac ablation procedure. Cardiac ablation procedures are a type of procedure to treat heart arrhythmias. So when you look at every head-to-head study that compared robotic cardiac ablation versus manual handheld cardiac ablation, you had significant reductions in adverse events. You had kind of just better outcomes for the patient. And so when you have a very elegant differentiated technology that is working in a robust fashion in the real world and has very good clinical benefits, that is as good as also a situation as you can ask for. So you have kind of this amazing discrepancy that suddenly comes kind of as you're doing this due diligence, as I'm doing this due diligence, suddenly I see on the one hand a company that is in the worst of positions and has a terrible setup, and on the other hand, as good of a foundation as you could ask for in terms of the differentiation and the validation and the clinical benefit. And so that's kind of an intriguing situation. And so you start to say, okay, how can it be that you have these two things taking place at the same time? You do a type of Harvard Business case study review to try to determine what actually took place in the company's history. And the company has an interesting longer term history. For anyone who's interested in some of our previous earnings calls who were publicly traded, I've talked about it, and you can probably find some of those discussed online. But as we start to kind of go through the history, you realize that there were mistakes made, and there were kind of challenges. There were issues of corporate governance and leadership, but those are again achievable, and this is really technology that can have a very positive impact on the world, and can become a really significant player in improving the medical device ecosystem. And so that was worthy of a much bigger effort than what we were used to, a much more active effort than what we were used to. And so about 3 years ago, we led investment in the company. As part of that investment, we took board seats, myself as well as two other medical device CEOs who I knew previously and were managing much larger companies. And very shortly thereafter, we implemented additional corporate governance changes at Stereotaxis, changed additional board members, and the CEO left, and I took his place.
But why you, right? So like most companies might say, hey, let's call Eleanor and tell her to do some hiring for us, and can you find us a CEO? Why did you decide to actually make the change, to actually sit in that seat yourself and drive that?
So one thing is kind of you want to make sure you always have alignment of interest. So obviously, as one of the largest shareholders of the company, or as a representative of one of the largest shareholders of the companies, I'm very much aligned with the entire goal of building up a great company. Actually, I joined without taking a salary at all. I'm not taking a salary. I'm entirely motivated by stock and really by building Stereotaxis into the potential that it holds. And so that's kind of one thing, that when you have alignment of interest, that's a prerequisite to kind of any successful relationship in business or otherwise. Second, having done the due diligence on the investment side and led that effort, I was relatively well aware of both the challenges and the opportunities for Stereotaxis, and what would make sense in terms of a path to gradually bring it back to health. And so I'd shown the interest and the effort in understanding the situation, and yeah, it was the board took a risk on me. I hadn't had an operational role at Daphne Capital, though. At the investment fund, I was very active in all parts of our operations. I have my accounting license, so I did all the CPA exams. I've managed our back office at Daphne. I've managed our IT, our marketing. I've been involved in the HR. So kind of to some extent, I had some experience with all aspects of that for an investment firm, which is different than a operating medical device firm. But I had some experience with all those different domains, and to some extent, you learn as you do things. So I'm very much in the mode throughout my life, and also with others, that oftentimes if you think someone is good and you think they can survive it, even if it's scary, you throw people into the deep end of the pool and you let them learn how to swim.
Yeah, it's a question that also kind of I'm asked frequently, right? Like, how do I get a job doing something I haven't done before? And obviously what you've done is a prime example. You just put yourself out there and you try to leverage experience that you have that gives you skills that would enable you to be successful in that role. and it's really about kind of harnessing what you already know and just learning as you go and just adapting as quickly as you can when you're put into that role. But it's also about, you know, putting yourself in a situation where you can be given a chance, you know. And as you said, you know, the board members, you know, they took a risk, but it seems to be paying off pretty well right now, I would say. I'm interested to know, so when you were in that mode of, okay, I've decided I'm interested to go forward for this role, this is what I'm imagining the role is going to be, and now, you know, as you're sitting in the role today, what's the difference between what you were expecting and actually what it ended up being?
I don't know. I don't know if I took too much time to anticipate how it would be.
Okay.
I guess kind of, you know, one thing I think kind of maybe for others who have not been yet in a CEO role is oftentimes people imagine things as glamorous, and I think you have to remember that everyone, I think, irrespective of their roles, irrespective of titles, and maybe this is also, you know, if they're doing the role the way it should be done, work is hard for most of us. Yes, you have periods that might be glamorous and quick periods of excitement. And every day, I mean, there is exciting aspects of the work constantly, but there is also just progress is usually driven by grinding through things, right? And so you have to sit, and you actually have to put in the work, and you actually have to read, and you have to actually prepare documents, and you have to write things out, and you have to refine then the writing, and you have to edit yourself, and you have to have many conversations and try to get to kind of the truth of a matter, and a lot of it is just grinding forward. And so, you know, it's don't if you want to do anything well, don't imagine that just as you rise in title, you rise in kind of, it becomes really a job where all you're doing is sitting back and strategizing and saying things to people and sitting comfortably on your chair, right? In reality, it should be the opposite, and in some ways it sometimes feels like the opposite, that when you lead, you should lead from the front, and that means actually that you're probably working harder than the teammates who work with you, and a lot of it might not be glamorous, but again, it maybe goes back to the discussion previously that most successes, most progress come from an accumulation of many small decisions, many small efforts, and you just have to put in that effort continuously and grind away.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In the time where you've been CEO at Stereotaxis, what would you say has been your most defining moment or your biggest success? Or the companies, not yours personally, but as a company.
I mean, what you've seen is that we have taken a company that to some extent had been static. So while the overall technology and the approach were highly innovative and highly kind of differentiated, it was a company that had gotten lost and had gotten into a type of stasis for many years, almost a decade. And to be able to re-energize the company, and that means that means the people, that means the way it's looked by the customers, by the marketplace, that means tangibly the way the things that are being done, the technology themselves, the ability to take something that had been stuck in a stasis and to see it suddenly vibrant again and moving and advancing and innovating. That is kind of, I think, the most heartwarming aspect of the job. And you know, last year and kind of earlier this year, we've announced all sorts of innovations. We came out with the first real meaningful new robot in the company's history from kind of its first commercialization 15 years ago. We've kind of driven innovation on the interventional devices side, on the connectivity side, on kind of some of the ancillary products around our robot. So kind of you walk into the office and kind of and have the discussions every day, and you realize that you have a company now that is active and that is really kind of forward looking, and that is pushing forward, and that is kind of living and breathing. It's not kind of anymore stuck in a stasis. And you don't know how exactly that transition happened, and it didn't happen at one point where you say this was the transition, but somehow kind of the accumulated effort of the last 2-3 years has allowed that to become the reality.
And just coming back to that as well, because you've spoken a lot about the technology and about what you're doing differently. I'm interested to know as well how the culture has changed, because surely, you know, when you joined, the culture of the company would have been totally different to where it is now. How would you describe that change?
So the two things that I guess I cared perhaps most about when I think about kind of culture, I think about the type of people you want on the team. One is that you want doers, and the second is that you want people who have an aligned interest and who kind of have and who share the view of what our mission is over the long term. And so kind of I think that that's really when you look at the changes in the team that has taken place, and you look at the change in mindset that has taken place, I think it's kind of those are probably the two biggest things I've tried to make sure happen across the team. When you look at kind of the concept of having a team full of doers, what happens in many organizations is that you have, and you know, all of us, either when we were in school or maybe at our current jobs, you have, let's say, group projects, and there are certain people on the group project who maybe don't really contribute in pushing any specific thing forward. They're more somehow involved, or they manage things, but they don't actually do. And for a small company, for startup companies, for kind of smaller companies, or if you want a nimble company, you don't want managers. You don't want people that just manage other people and tell other people what to do. You want people who, to some extent, yes, you need to do some management, some leadership, but you want to lead by example, and you want everyone should be functionally contributing and having a specialty that is really valuable to the company, and be able to contribute to the effort to move forward. And so, you know, I on the one hand, you know, I might be the one on the boat who's kind of advising people how to row and in which direction to row, but I have I'm rowing as well with everyone else, and that should be, again, every part of the organization. So it doesn't matter which part of the organization you lead, you should be individually contributing as well, not just kind of telling other people what to do. And I think that once you have that type of mindset, it's good not only in that it's kind of more efficient and you have kind of more people kind of actually pushing things forward, but I think also it creates the right mindset. It's a terrible setup when the people who are more senior are really not in the trenches pushing things forward, and are living in a little bit of an ivory tower. And it doesn't give them the right perspective on why things take place, on how it needs to take place, on the challenges of actually creating a change in reality. And it also can create, depending on the people, it can create also understandable resentment from those who are actually pushing things forward and doing all the work, towards those who are kind of, you know, just guiding them, advising them, but not actually helping. And so I think that when you kind of shift to a company culture where you have doers, that's a positive, I think, for any company. And then the second thing is really this alignment of interest. If you have, for example, board members that are being paid in cash, and kind of, you know, that's probably a mistake. Probably they should be being paid entirely in stock. And we made that change very, very quickly. As soon as I came, that was actually the first change we made in the company, because you want really the board members, they probably don't need the cash for their daily kind of life. So in reality, they should be motivated entirely by the success of the company. The same for myself. I'm fortunate I didn't need to take a salary, and so I'm going to be motivated entirely by kind of the success of the company. And I think that when you make sure, and obviously most employees, most people can't have that reality, so obviously you do compensate them. There is kind of it's not that you kind of are. It's not that you kind of go away from that entirely, but you want to have a company where and you can see it oftentimes in people, and you know it as you have more and more discussions with them. You know who's motivated purely by the money, and who's motivated, who wants to make sure that they're compensated fairly, and that they can have kind of, that they can raise their family, and that they can have kind of a good life, but who's really kind of intrinsically motivated by the mission in front of us. And kind of, you want to, gradually you want to reward more and encourage and build a company that has many more of the latter and fewer of the former.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I really love this concept as well of doers, making sure that you surround yourself with doers. When you're looking at potentially hiring someone, as a leader within your business, how do you identify if somebody is actually a doer, or is just saying that they're a doer?
It is very hard. Interviewing people is very, very hard, and I guess that's where your specialty comes in. That would be a much better question for you to answer. I mean, I've talked with CEOs of medical device companies that have hired 1,000+ people over their careers. So really kind of long-term careers, hiring many different people, and the advice they've given me is that still it's a 50-50 whether kind of their assessment during the interviews actually plays out once the individual's at the organization. And so what I say is that it is very, very difficult. Now, when you are working with someone, you get to know fairly quickly, but you actually only get to know if you're in the trenches with them. So again, 100%. If you're stuck in the ivory tower, oftentimes you get information from different people that is not congruent. You have to kind of, it's not obvious what the truth is. As soon as you start to get into the details of the daily work, and you're in the trenches and you're working with people, then it becomes very, very obvious very quickly who's a doer and who kind of who might talk more or might be very involved, but doesn't actually ever kind of start to carry the load.
What's your advice to, let's say that there might be a leader now listening to this who has identified that somebody is not a doer in their team? What do you do with that person? Do you coach them to become a doer, or do you cut your losses?
I think it depends really on every individual scenario. There's no cookie cutter solution, right? In some scenarios, and that depends both on the individuals involved, and it depends on the environment and the company's situation overall. In certain situations, it might be more toxic, and it might be, and there might be financial constraints, and there might be other things where you just should, you need to make kind of more kind of rapid decisions, and you should just kind of make difficult decisions quickly and upfront. And then there's scenarios where you might just kind of use a mix of both coaching and guidance, and incrementally encouraging them through various means to find a better home that's more fitting for them.
So just circling back, because I'm really interested to understand about goal setting, and if that's something that you do or believe in. I've had the pleasure of speaking to people who are kind of like, no, I have never goal set. I just kind of go with it, and I'm flexible, and I just kind of go with the flow. And then other people are really kind of planned and know what they want to achieve by when, and set smart targets and all that kind of stuff. What's your perspective on that?
So I think both people that you spoke to are very much right, and both work very, very well. I think if you look at in life, right, you have things happen because of two things. Either you proactively go out there into the world and try to grab something, try to make something happen, or it isn't. I'm not making actually. I don't think that one is better than the other. I think both are very kind of good ways, and I'm just stating things as I see it, not trying to give kind of any kind of statement on if one is better than the other. But one is that kind of you go out there into the world and try to chase something and grab it and make that change. And the second is that things come to you, and opportunities come to you, and now even in that second, it's not entirely passive, because what you have to do is you have to have the mind and the eye to be able to notice when opportunities present themselves to you. And oftentimes things pass right in front of your face, and if your mind is not primed to pick it up, you won't even notice it come by, or you might notice it, but you don't know how to react, and you don't know how to react well or quickly enough. And so I think kind of success and growth in life can happen kind of through both kind of mechanisms, and it's okay that it happens in both mechanisms. And in certain ways, you want to have a general view of what type of career path, what types of things would be motivating for you, how you would like your life to move forward. And if there are ways that you can proactively try to advance along that path, that's great. Oftentimes you'll find in your career that you're just stuck, and you don't know what's the practical thing to do as a next step. And there might not be an easy next step proactively to do. And then you should just make sure, is my mind primed? Have I thought through this? Will I notice an opportunity when it comes to me? And try to put yourself in situations where you might notice those opportunities, where they might come to you, and be prepared for them. And so I think kind of, again, life is not linear in all aspects, not just professionally. We all go through ups and downs and twists and turns, and kind of and if you can generally proactively try to move in directions that will make you happy, and if you can make sure that your mind and your eyes are primed to notice opportunities as they come by, then overall you should do fine.
I was at a talk a couple of months ago, and the speaker said something on that, which was, opportunities are never lost, they're just discovered by someone else. And it's all about being receptive to it, isn't it? It's about, having your eye open and evaluating it on a case-by-case basis, because if you are closed, it might just pass you by. I thought that was really powerful. Let's talk about the future then, just to kind of to wrap up. So one I'd love to know is kind of like the future of Stereotaxis, because it sounds, like an incredible journey that you've been on, but it doesn't sound like you're done just yet. It sounds like there's still quite a lot more that you want to achieve with the company. So what's coming up?
Yeah, Stereotaxis is still, I think we're kind of in the first innings of kind of what we actually envision doing with the company. If you look at kind of just cardiac ablation for the treatment of arrhythmias as one clinical application, one type of endovascular surgical procedure, I mean, 99% of procedures in that field are being done manually using handheld catheters and kind of a human manipulating it with their hands. So obviously, just within that field, there's a tremendous amount still to do to transition that field towards robotics. And I believe that transition is one that's fundamentally positive for patients, and fundamentally positive for physicians, and fundamentally positive for the field. And then obviously, outside of cardiac ablation, there are dozens of different interventional procedures, probably 10 or so that are $1 billion plus large procedures that impact hundreds of thousands, millions of patients each year. And really, Stereotaxis hasn't worked at all to address any of those yet. And so I think kind of there's obviously a lot still to be done in terms of advancing robotics into interventional medicine. And we have kind of, we're actively working on the things that are necessary to start that. And I think that kind of ends up, the effort that's necessary to cause that shift is largely driven by the technology side. And so what I'd say is that there is, I think kind of if anyone goes to our website and sees how our technology is used, or goes to our YouTube pages and watches a full procedure, we have a full procedure on our YouTube page, and you can see how the technology is currently being used. And what I would just say is that even with the innovations that we've announced over the last year, there's still much more that can be done. We're not at the limits of what technology is able to do, and so there's much more that can be done to make the therapy better for patients, to make the experience better for the physician user, to make the technology overall more accessible and affordable. And so I think kind of that's we know what we have to do internally to continue pushing the ball forward.
What does success look like for you?
Success looks like to me for Stereotaxis is us transforming endovascular surgery in the same way that intuitive surgical transformed laparoscopic surgery. You have now kind of many laparoscopic surgical fields, from urology to gynecology to thoracic surgery to abdominal surgery to even things like ENT that are all being revolutionized by the Da Vinci system. And to some extent in the future, I expect that if right now in the United States about 85-90% of prostatectomies are done robotically, I would assume that in the coming years, there's definitely the clinical data is I would argue better for using robotics in cardiac ablation than it is for using robotics in urology. And so I would hope and expect that at some point in our future, we will see that 85-90% of cardiac ablation procedures are being done robotically, and then kind of additional endovascular procedures should probably follow.
It's a big vision, but it's a really exciting time to be in this space. I mean, you're getting me excited even just by talking about it. So, okay. So we spoke about success.
Now you know why I rolled up my sleeves and joined Stereotaxis full time.
Yeah, I mean it's fantastic. I think it's game-changing stuff that you guys are doing. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how this all develops over the next few years, and I will be following you guys closely. So you spoke about success for Stereotaxis. So the last thing that I just want to kind of close up on is about you, right? So, and this is the question that I ask everybody, and it's the super big question, but I think it's important to also put things into perspective. What is the legacy that you want to leave on the world?
I don't know. These questions are tough. You want to do, right? You have a limited amount of time on the world. You have a limited amount of bandwidth. You want to have as good of a positive impact on the trajectory of the world as possible. And so you try to use your skills and your limited energy and influence and intellect and time to do as much good as you can, and obviously everyone, or most people, those who are trying to have a positive influence on the world, each one tries to do it in their own way. And so someone who's actually not working at all might try to do it by raising good children and by being a good neighbor and by kind of beautifying the world around them. And in my position, given kind of what I've learned, what kind of my skill set is, right now I try to do it by pushing forward medical innovation and by making sure that the right technologies that treat patients well advance, and that we transform kind of the way medicine is performed into a smarter, more effective, better way.
And with Stereotaxis, it gives you the ability to have access to potentially transform so many lives. So it's a super exciting time. David, thank you so much for being a guest on Career Diaries by Elemed. It's been really interesting speaking with you and learning all about, your career challenges, your tips for everyone, and your thoughts and perspectives on certain things. Good luck with Stereotaxis. I will definitely be following you guys, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners will be too.
Thank you.
And for everybody who is listening, that was David Fischel from Stereotaxis. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment. Share your thoughts with us. And that's it for this episode of Career Diaries by Elemed. Have a lovely day and speak to you soon.